Meet me on the softer side. Meet me on the softer side. Softer side of your heart.
Hi there, and welcome to the Skylight Books author reading series. You can find out about this and all of our other author events at www.skylightbooks.com, where you can also browse our inventory as well as order books online. You can also follow us on Twitter or even be our friend at facebook.com. If you'd like to talk to a real person, we can be reached at 323-660-1175. And don't forget, Skylight Books depends on listeners like you to help support us. So whether you're in our neighborhood or browsing online, buy a book or two to help ensure that we'll be around for a long, long time. Thanks and enjoy.
Now it is my pleasure to introduce someone that a lot of you already know about because Skylight Books is a really big fan of David Graeber. A lot of you are here because Charles, our book buyer, grabbed you at one point in time and steered you to a copy of fragments of an anarchist anthropology or another work, or you saw the copies of Debt that I plastered all over the store in the fall. And I think I was excited to realize I think Direct Action and Ethnography is actually one of the first books that I bought at Skylight when I visited LA a couple years ago, so it's a nice tie-in. But he's well known for lots of other reasons. In the fall was one of the folks who helped kick off the Occupy Wall Street movement. I know a lot of you are here for that, but also an anthropologist, theorist of ideas about value, currently a reader at Goldsmiths College in London doing work there, guy with a lot of ideas, and he's here to talk with you about them. So I'd like to introduce David Graeber.
It's not going to work, is it? Wow. Thanks so much for having me. I guess I wanted to talk a little bit about how I came to write this book, which is an odd story. It's part of a kind of long, ongoing series of efforts to try to figure out what the role of an intellectual should be in relation to new forms of social movement that we've had nowadays, or that I was first introduced to around 2000. When I got involved in the global justice movement, and I should preface that saying I came to political engagement surprisingly late. I actually read somewhere the other day that I've been an anarchist since I was 16. I guess that must be true. I was told that to somebody sometime. But it was in a very theoretical sense. The way I always put it, my father fought in Spain. I come from a political family. My father was in the Abraham Lincoln Battalion. Actually, he was an ambulance driver. But he's with the Internationals. He was posted in Barcelona during the war. I should explain that he had me rather late in life. But he was posted in Barcelona, and during the 30s, 36, 37, when he was there, Barcelona was essentially run on anarchist principles. Which has a really interesting historical experiment in all sorts of different ways. For one thing, they discovered that the people who largely took over the functions of government when they got rid of the government was the telephone operators. The telephone operators union. People would call up and ask to talk to the government, and the operator would say, "No, I'm sorry, there is no government." They'd say, "Well, can you solve this problem?" They'd have to do it, and according to my father, actually, he always felt that what he really learned from Barcelona was that he said it was one of the great historical experiments in a way, because what they managed to determine in Barcelona in '36 was that white-collar workers don't really do anything, because their basic mode of economic reform was to fire all white-collar workers and just carry on without them, and it really didn't make any difference. Those guys basically exist to make other people feel bad about themselves, but they don't really do much else. And so I learned all this, and it had an influence on me in that, okay, the way I always put it is that most people don't think anarchism is a bad idea. They think it's insane. I mean, if you ask the average person, they'll say, well, yeah, it would be great. No police, no prisons, everybody's nice to each other, we all cooperate. Dream on, And in fact, my father had been in a place where, he was with the internationals, and they were brought in, through the Third International, which was Stalinist. They didn't know that at the time. But they were heavily propagandized against the anarchists, but he was, saw what was going on. He had a lot of anarchist friends. He felt it was a, legitimate experiment. Eventually came to really take their side on most issues. But he didn't think anarchism was crazy. That's the point. He knew it could work. And if you don't think it's crazy, well, there's really very little reason not to be an anarchist. So I figured, all right, I'm an anarchist. It didn't really mean much. Occasionally I did try to get involved in, sort of libertarian, socialist, left-wing politics. I'd show up at different groups, and maybe I just had bad luck, or maybe it was a period in the 80s. There wasn't a lot going on. I just remember being immediately turned off by what they passed for anarchist groups, at least that I saw, were largely these sort of accumulations of individuals who acted like they were sectarian parties made up of just one person, and just yelled at each other all the time. I would leave. So I became an anthropologist, went to University of Chicago. I ended up going to Madagascar to do my field work, and I guess I should have known something was going on, because what drew me to Madagascar was my advisor, Marshall Solins, who suggested I go there. He said, I think your mind works like that. Still have no idea what he meant by this. I read a bunch of fairy tales and folk tales from Madagascar, and I was immediately, I just thought they were great. The sort of epic cycle of Madagascar involves this young guy who decides he wasn't created by God, and he wants God to acknowledge this. So there's all these magical battles between him and God. They're kind of subversive there. It turns out, largely because I think Madagascar is mainly made up of two different populations of escaped slaves, one from Africa, one from Indonesia, kind of met and created this rebel culture. But as I say, I didn't know this, and I wandered into Madagascar only to actually be, just as my father, sort of walked into a place where the government had been overthrown. I did too, but it took me 6 months to figure it out, because nobody wanted to admit it. Everybody was like, what, government? Yeah, there's government. There's offices down there. There's people working in the offices, And it was true. There were people typing things and registering things. And I later discovered that they weren't being paid, and they actually had to buy their own paper, because the government really wasn't supplying anything. They were just kind of pretending. Basically what seems to have happened was that people in Madagascar in general, they're sort of masters of, particularly rural people, masters of passive resistance. They've got this down to an art that we could not imagine. Layer on layer and layer of the thing. So sort of the first layer, for your first response, you're living in the countryside, some guy shows up and tells you to do all sorts of things you don't want to do. First response is be really nice to them, ask intelligent questions, give them coffee. And then when they go away, pretend the whole thing never happened. What guy? No, there was nobody here on Tuesday. What are you talking about? So this is like stage one, and there's like 37 steps. It was difficult under the French colonial regime, but suddenly it had become much easier because the government was running out of money. They couldn't really afford to keep up the police in the countryside anyway, since nobody was paying taxes. So you had this sort of shadow government, everybody pretending there was a government, even because they made it as easy as possible for the people who are supposed to be the government to just play along. We'll be incredibly respectful to you, and as long as you don't try to exercise your authority in any way. But if you do, will figure out thousands of subtle ways to make your life a living hell. So people were playing along. I was fooled, and the only way I really figured out what was going on was, I guess there's this guy named Henri, I guess in a place, this is a town, by the way, it's like an hour out of the capital, it's a town of about 10,000, 12,000 people. And the surrounding countryside is where I was working, called a Rivon Imam. And in a Rivon Imam, there was this one guy who was kind of the town bully. He was this really big guy. He was either insane or pretended to be insane. Opinions were divided on that. He would like steal things, beat people up, guilty of multiple cases of sexual assault. He's bad news. And people decided, okay, we've got to do something about this guy. But apparently there is a principle in Madagascar that if you want to lynch someone, you have to get their parents' permission first. If you think about it, it's a pretty much guarantees it's not going to happen very often. And if it does, it's probably a pretty good reason. So, after about 3 times, basically it's a way of getting your dad or mom to be able to say, like, look, kid, you really better clean up your act. I don't know how long I could front you here. After a while, his father said, okay, whatever, do what you have to do. Sort of a Frankenstein scenario. They came after him, agricultural implements, and he was wounded, ran into the local Catholic church and demanded sanctuary, claiming he was persecuted because he was mentally ill. And the priest said, okay, and drove him off to an insane asylum where they kicked him out a few days later for beating up the other patients, but he didn't come back, so it kind of worked. But I was hearing this story, and, for a while, I was like, okay. And it suddenly occurred to me, I asked my friends, wait a minute, there's like a police station, like 2 blocks away from here. And she was like, yeah, but, have you seen Henri? He's enormous. I don't want to fight him. It's like, they're cops, they have guns. And it's like, they're not going to shoot him. So it seemed like police are there to keep the highway open and fight bandits. And that's pretty much all they do. They don't go off the paved road. And even in town, they have a limited purview. So I realized that there's, I was actually living in a sort of anarchist society. I go back to Chicago. I write my dissertation. I get a job at Yale. One day I'm walking out of class and I see a newspaper headline saying martial law declared in Seattle. And like most people in America, I said, huh? Nobody had any warning about this. Did some quick research, discovered that the social movement that I'd always sort of wished would exist but didn't had actually formed when I wasn't paying attention. And, so I sort of was like, okay, where do I join? Showed up at the Direct Action Network meetings in New York, quickly got involved, and the big thing in the Direct Action Network was consensus process, which was new to all of us. This sort of exciting new method of decision-making and learning facilitation trainings and doing all this sort of thing was an eye-opener to me in 2 really profound ways that sort of set me off on this intellectual problem I've been pursuing ever since. And one of those was one rather minor shock was the realization that that's what people had been doing in Madagascar that I hadn't even been completely aware of. I mean, I was aware that people used consensus to make decisions in this sort of free zone. I ended up calling it a provisional autonomous zone outside of the state. But the thing is, like, they were really good at it. These guys have been doing this for 1,000 years. Everybody learns it when they're growing up. This is how decisions are made. So they don't have to spell it out or talk about it. And it was, we were terrible. We had no idea what we were doing. Because, we were Americans. We go around the world claiming we're the most democratic society on earth, but, like, how often have any of us actually sat down in a group of people and made a democratic decision? Like, never. Maybe when you're ordering pizza or something like that. So we had no idea what we were doing. We had to learn it all from scratch, spell it all out. And as a result, I suddenly understood all these things that I'd actually seen back in Madagascar that just like floated right by me at the time. I was like, oh, that's what that guy was doing, is blocking. Okay. And actually, they take Bloch to a whole different level. And in Madagascar, there's like the existential Bloch. You can like suddenly just get up and say, wait, I don't agree. And everybody's like, oh no, what are we going to do? And I remember witnessing this. It's like, nobody asked him to agree to anything. What's going on? This is a sort of way of saying something is terribly wrong. I block everything. Everybody has to scramble and figure out like how to make him happy. All right, so retrospectively, I understood that, these guys have been doing this for ages. They were much better than us, and we were just slowly trying to figure out how to do this. But I also, one of the ways we were doing it was always good to have a diametrical opposite against which you can define yourself. So for us, that was people like the Direct Action Network, basically what I call small A anarchist groups. They operated on anarchist principles, but your ideology is your own business. What we really defined ourselves against were these. Imagine the sort of classic sectarian Trotskyist or Maoist group. I won't mention any names, but those guys, there's like 13 people in them, but they're a political party that's going to seize political power, and they have to have a position on all global issues, and they sell newspapers, those guys. But they always have an intellectual leader who sort of defines reality for you. And if you don't agree, you get cut off. And, the definition of reality is much more important than internal process, which they hardly think about. So we wanted to be the opposite of that. We were about radical heterogeneity. You shouldn't even try to move people over to your point of view. Rather, democracy is sort of like problem solving. So if we all have incommensurable perspectives, it actually helps because, who would better solve a problem of 20 clones or 20 people with a different point of view? So if, that was shocking only because, I started like doing this. When you're an anthropologist, you kind of can't help yourself. You start doing ethnography. You're trained to do it, and you're sitting in the meeting taking notes because everybody's taking notes, and suddenly you realize you're doing little charts and diagrams and mapping out what kind of shoes people are wearing. And this started happening. And so I started, observing this an ethnography of sectarianness. And how we were trying to invert that. I even actually ended up making a list at one point of how to make a sectarian argument. There were 3 principles, if I remember correctly. Number 1 is, okay, you're listening to somebody else talking, and there's 2 ways to interpret something they say, an argument they're making, one of which gives them some credit for common sense. Don't choose that one. Okay, so that's principle 1. Number 2 is make up a list of 27 ways to be wrong. Then listen to other people only long enough to figure out which category of wrongness to plug them into. Then explain to them what they think. So it's like, oh, you're a cooperativist. You think. Guys like that, right? And number 3 is, how to turn a sort of minor intellectual difference into a vast moral flaw. You disagree with my interpretation of Bartleby the Scrivener. Obviously, you are a racist. That sort of thing. Okay, so, but the horrible thing was like, this is the way that annoying Trotskyists argue and so forth and so on. But it's also the way I was trained to argue at the University of Chicago, and I realized that actually, academic practice is really not that different. There is a structural analogy, especially to Marxist groups, and I don't want to put down Marxism as a whole, but like it does have a certain affinity to the academy. I mean, Marx did have a PhD. Each group is formed around an intellectual leader, whereas anarchist groups tend to be. Anarchists don't say, I'm a Malatestian and you're a Kropotkinite, so I hate you. And you might say, I'm a syndicalist and you're a platformist, so I hate you. But it's not about, the thought of some guy. So the question then becomes, well, if you're not going to become the intellectual leader and lay down your analysis of reality, which will bring people to the appropriate level of consciousness and all that kind of vanguardist stuff, well, what do you do? I mean, what would an actual intellectual practice, which would be more in conformity to this, new form of, to us new form of political practice actually be like? And I've been struggling with this question in a million different ways ever since. I don't know if I come up with a solution. well, maybe in the spirit of radical heterogeneity, then, there isn't one solution. Probably true. But some of the solutions I have attempted, I wrote a book, Fragments of an Anarchist Anthropology. I wrote an ethnography of direct action, which I thought using ethnographic techniques would actually help disseminate the sort of core ideas that people are not entirely aware of in what they do. I wrote a number of different things. But the debt book is actually in there, but it's kind of a weird one, because the book, I ended up becoming fascinated with debt. I became fascinated with debt largely because I wanted to understand the strange moral power. It's like more of a know your enemy kind of book. The strange moral power that the concept of debt has over people, that it seems to be able to justify things that you could never justify under any other circumstances. That's why I started the book the way I do, with this conversation I have had at Westminster Abbey. I won't even begin to explain how I ended up actually living in Westminster Abbey for a month and a half. It was very weird. They give the priests these really big apartments, and they don't pay them very much, so they rent rooms. You can actually get a room in Westminster Abbey. So here I was, had this garden party at Westminster Abbey, and the priest is very nice, but he's introducing me to everyone, but he's very, sort of gracious person, except he has this incredibly annoying habit of bringing me to people and saying, "Hello, I'd like you to meet David Graeber. He's an anarchist." I was like, yeah, that kind of limits possibilities for future conversation. Anyway, so just as I was wondering whether to remonstrate with him about this habit, he brings me up to this young woman who's an activist. He says, this is a person you really like. She's also an activist. She's involved in all these community campaigns. She's a lawyer. So I say, okay, and I'm talking to her, sort of, what do you do? What do I do? We're chatting, nice person. Tells me about her work, asks about mine. I'm talking about global justice movement, campaigns against the IMF, in particular structural adjustment policies. I tell some stories about Madagascar. IMF structural adjustment policies had deeply ambivalent effects on Madagascar. Some of them were actually good, but completely by accident. That is to say, that's kind of why the government was willing to give up on the police. Because usually when they cut the budget, the police is the last thing they cut. But in Madagascar, to their credit, I must say, they just basically took the police out of rural areas and said, you guys know how to govern yourselves anyway, and we're not getting any taxes from you, so what the hell. So that was good, but they also got rid of things like mosquito eradication programs, because they just, because God forbid Citibank could take a 1% on their interest rate haircut on loans that represent 0.001% of their portfolio, rather let us many people die, which is in fact what happens when you get rid of mosquito eradication programs. There had been one for 30 years, at least, 50 years, in the highlands of Madagascar. They couldn't afford to keep it up because of the IMF budget cuts. Malaria returned, everybody lost their immunity. This is like a year before I shut up. There was an epidemic. I think 10,000 people died, 5,000 of whom were children. I was telling the story. She was, well, that's terrible. What were you, actually proposing to do about this kind of thing? So I said, well, drop the debt. I was involved, we supported Jubilee 2000. I wasn't actually in Jubilee 2000, but, we worked with them. This group that said, well, we should just cancel third world debt. And she looked at me and was like, but wait, they borrowed the money, right? I mean, surely you have to pay your debts. And I was like, oh, one of those conversations, right? Because, we've all had them. But, I thought this was a friend. She was a nice person. It's just like, all right. So it's kind of like, okay, which of the 27 different... Which one do I do first? I didn't really borrow the money. It was all in a Swiss bank account. Somebody stole it. Do you talk about the interest? Actually, they paid back the money 12 times, but through the miracle of compounded interest rates, and it'll take another 400 years to pay it. Which one do you use? I actually ended up going for the economic one. that seemed like might be the most powerful. The economic one is actually surprising people don't use it more. According to economic theory, profit is your reward for taking risk. If you're not taking a risk, why are you getting the profit? There's a logic to that. The financial system is supposed to guide investment towards profitable investments. So if you have some guys like the IMF to come in and say nobody ever defaults ever, no matter what happens, no matter how stupid the investment, well, what's to stop, you from just walking into the bank and saying, like, I got a hot tip on the horses, can I have $12 million? And, they'll say, yeah, sure. Since after all, if you don't win on the horses, I can just sell your sister into slavery or, take your organs or something. So which is the equivalent of what was basically imposed on the third world. All right, so I went into all this, and that was fine. But afterwards, I started thinking about it, and I thought, well, this is a really nice person. She's socially conscious. She's an activist. What other circumstance would a person like that hear a story involving the death of 5,000 babies and try to justify it? Something was terribly wrong here. And what is it about the moral power of death that makes people say, things like that? It really haunted me. Surely you must pay your debts, because something like that is like 5 or 6 words, and the response of why this is insane takes half an hour, 10 minutes. And how did that happen? Why do people think that? Why does that one kind of morality seem to trump any other? And that's what really set me off. And we got to get to the bottom of this if we're going to get anywhere, because debt is everywhere. I mean, as soon as I started thinking about it, so I realized that almost all political campaigns I've been involved with had to do with debt in some way or another. And almost everything has to do with debt nowadays. I mean, modern nation state runs on deficit financing, consumer economies run on debt, international relations are all about debt. Yet, it's not even clear what debt is, and no one's ever written a history of it. And that was really shocking, because I thought about it and I thought, well, how many things are there that nobody has ever written a history of? Surprisingly few, I mean, you can get a history of salt, a history of cod. There's a French guy who wrote a history of shit. It's a human waste disposal through the ages. It's actually called that. Nobody's written a history of debt. I mean, people have written histories of money. But histories of money actually don't even turn out to be histories of money. Almost invariably, they turn out to be histories of coinage. But one thing I discovered when researching this book is that the vast majority of monetary transactions in history haven't used coinage. They've been credit transactions. But I guess, coinage, you can dig them up, and credit transactions, you really can't. You can sometimes see histories of credit, but it's not exactly the same. So I started researching the book, and one of the first things I discovered was that moral ambivalence that I saw, that immediate reaction of surely one must pay one's debts, and then the conversation, well, but no, you don't. I mean, why do you think that? That's silly. That conversation has been going on for 5,000 years. Over and over and over again, you find, well, on the most superficial level, you could say, there's 2 things that you see in almost all times and places where money exists. One is the tendency to reduce all moral obligations to debts. To talk about morality is simply a matter of paying your debts. That's all morality is. The other is the assumption that people who lend money are evil, which, if you think about it, is kind of hard to square, right? And on a deeper level, you see that, like, over and over again, great works of religious thought, great works of philosophy, when they talk about morality and justice, they almost invariably, they start like that. They say, okay, well, what is morality? Morality is just debt. And then they say, no, actually it isn't, is it? I mean, Plato's Republic is the most obvious example, right? Most of us, I imagine, are familiar with this from some point in our lives. The book starts with the question, what is justice? And there's this rich arms manufacturer, whose name actually means capital, Kephalos, who says, simple. I mean, justice is just a matter of paying your debts and maybe not lying. And Socrates blows that one out of the water immediately, right? He says, oh, that doesn't work. I mean, like, say somebody lends me his sword. I'm sorry. Say somebody lends me his sword, and then he goes violently insane and wants it back to kill people. Obviously, I'm not going to give it back. That wouldn't be just, and I'll probably make up some lie as to why I can't. And he says, oh, well, okay, not that, something else then, I don't know. I don't care, I gotta go to some ritual. And so they take it up, and his son takes it up, and everybody else takes it up, and the rest of the book is if not that, then what? But it always starts with that, I mean, you see that pattern over and over again. I noticed the same thing in the Brahmanas. The Rig Veda has all these metaphors about debt, and they try to systematize it. And these are first real theological works of tradition, which has come to be known as Hinduism. The Brahmanas, they actually start by posing all moral obligations as debts in a similar way, but only in such a way as to show it's absurd. So they say, what is life? Life is a debt you owe to the gods. You pay the interest with animal sacrifice, and then when you die, you're paying the principal. Then they say, well, you owe other debts as well. Everybody's born with a debt to your parents. How do you pay your debt to your parents? You become a parent. You owe a debt to the sages who created wisdom. How do you pay them? You learn, you study, you become a sage. You owe a debt to humanity for making life possible and all those things that make your life and existence good. How do you pay humanity? Well, you are hospitable to strangers. And if you look at the examples they use, it quickly becomes obvious that they're not really talking about debts in any recognizable sense at all, right? Because, you pay your debt to your parents by becoming a parent. Well, you don't actually pay your debt to somebody who lends you money by giving money to someone else. What they're actually saying is you become the thing which you owed. You erase the difference. And the same thing with the sages, and you pay your debt to humanity by becoming humane. So how does that apply to the gods? Well, the gods represent the cosmos. And if you think about it, what is a debt? A debt is it's a relation between two equals where they make an agreement. Somebody lends somebody something else, somebody pays somebody something else. But it's a business transaction. But business transactions which are sort of by definition between two legally equivalent entities. So I'm doing a business deal with the cosmos, with everything that ever existed or ever will, including myself. How would I come to a deal with the cosmos? The very idea is absurd, and what you're really recognizing in a ritual when you think about it is that you are one with the cosmos, and the debt doesn't exist. So the way of paying back the debt is realizing there isn't one. In a similar way, the Old Testament, in both Sanskrit and Aramaic, the word for sin, guilt, and debt are actually the same. So, for example, the Lord's Prayer, I always like to pull this one out. We all know the Anglican translation, forgive us our trespasses just as we forgive those who trespass against us. That was in the 1600s they came up with that one. The original translation was by John Wycliffe, which was a literal translation from the Aramaic, which is or the Greek, which is taken from the Aramaic. But they all say the same thing, which is forgive us our debts, just as we forgive those who owe us money. But of course, there's a trick there, right? Because we don't actually forgive those who owe us money, not usually. So, it's kind of a way of saying that you're a sinner. You don't deserve to be forgiven at all, but God will do it anyway because there is redemption, which is, of course, a financial term. So is reckoning. Actually, almost all the language of sin is taken from the language of Bronze Age finance. But they had the custom at that time of periodically canceling debts, which is the act of sacred kings, and then it becomes institutionalized in jubilees. So the sacred, what is sacred is not paying debts. What's sacred is forgiving debts. So it's the same thing. They start with debt as morality, and then they say, well, no, actually, it's not. It's a canceling debts, which is morality. So then you have to ask the question, well, if none of them believe that debt is morality, why do they all have to start by saying it is? Why are they caught with this morality that they don't actually believe in? And the best I could come up with is, I started thinking All right, they're using the language of the time. What were people arguing about if you're, it's 800 BC and you're in a tavern in Mesopotamia arguing about politics? We don't know. But chances are there were all sorts of political slogans of the time, and almost certainly all these religious texts are referring to them using that language. So we're reading it now, we have no idea, right? So we're probably reading the Bronze Age equivalent of like, it's the economy, stupid, or some phrase like that, and just not recognizing. It's like, what an interesting turn of phrase they're using these religious texts. But so presumably debt was all over the place as something to argue about. And in fact, it was because, and this is the reason why words debt, guilt, and sin become the same words, because it was the language of politics. Benjamin Franklin made the famous line that, there's nothing certain but death and taxes, but this is not actually true. It's just death. In the ancient world, often, people didn't have to pay taxes. Sumerian conquered people had to pay taxes. Taxes were tribute. And ancient Athens actually got money from the government. People were paid to vote. You know that? I thought this was great. It's my two great discoveries about ancient Athens that most people don't know because it just disturbs us too much. One was that everybody was paid to go to the agora. The other was that Athenian women had to wear veils. But completely messes up all our conceptions of everything. All right, so before I get to that, so people didn't really have to pay taxes. Conquered people did, but what basically conquering armies discovered, and pretty much mafiosi understand this, that debt is if you have a relation of violent inequality and you want to make it seem moral, debt is the perfect language. It's the best technique ever developed to do this. And not only does it make it seem moral, it makes it seem like the moral reprobate is the victim. So, imagine the scenario, you've just conquered someone and you announce, all right, you all owe me your lives because I could have killed you and I didn't. I will expect payment for these lives you owe me. But I'm a nice guy. I'm going to let you off the hook for the first 6 months. And after that, terms are negotiable if you're really in trouble. But I really do expect you to come through on this. And suddenly, the victims are all scurrying around feeling bad about themselves. And, you get to be the nice guy. So it's great from your point of view. On the other hand, it has a tendency to blow up because there's that problem of equality again. A debt is a relationship ostensibly between equals. You could equal it up. And it tends to really annoy people. So, it works, but when it blows up in a big way. The famous classicist Moses Finley had this famous line that there's basically one revolutionary program in all of antiquity, which is cancel the debts and redistribute the land. Which is interesting because it shows two things. It shows that everybody was in debt, which is fascinating in itself. Think about it, right? Like most people who've ever lived have been in debt. To whom? How'd that happen? What did those guys do that was so great that everybody was in debt to them? But clearly it's an imposed technique of rule. So all insurrections seem to be about debt. 90%. Much more so than slavery or caste or serfdom or all the things you'd think people would be upset about. In a way, it makes a certain sense, right? Because, incidentally, this remains true, until relatively recent times. I was just going through some of the writings of people like John Adams on why he hated democracy. Because, the founding fathers were all totally against democracy. And at one point he's discussing why we can't have majority vote, and he just spells it out, totally. Adams is more upfront about it than most of them. And he says, well, we can't have majority vote because we have 9 million people in this country with property and 2 million who don't have. The moment we had majority vote, what's going to happen? The first thing they'll do is they'll cancel the debts. After that, they'll redistribute the land. So it's the same thing, This is, so why are insurrections about debt? Well, it seems to be, I think this is the most sensible explanation, it's because of that assumption of equality. It's one thing to say you are inferior. Nobody's going to like that very much. But it's another thing to say, well, you should be my equal, but you fucked up. You're completely inadequate. You didn't do what you're supposed to do. And, it's very easy to get indignant about that. And when you're indignant, what do you say? You start saying, well, wait a minute, who owes what to who here, you know? I owe you, what do I owe you? What did you ever do? I mean, I'm the guy who makes the food around here, you owe me. So the moment you actually start saying things like that, what are you done? You've turned debt into morality, right? You're actually using the language of debt and universalizing it. You're using the master's language, and thus, you know, the only way you can argue with power is to use this language of debt. Thus, you see people when they try to like think in more broad, profound, you know, reflexive ways. So starting with debt, because that's the language you've got to use, and then saying yes, of course, except not really. It doesn't really work at all that way. Okay, so that's one start. And there's another sense, I think, comes from commercial relations. As soon as you start imagining everything we do, all our relations with one another as exchange. This is a more subtle argument, but I should mention it quickly. One of the arguments in my book is that we have a tendency, especially in commercial economies, to start thinking of everything we do as exchange, and all morality is exchange, reciprocity is the basic moral principle, so forth and so on. This is not true. In fact, there's always multiple different types of moral principles at play, including that can govern transactions involving moving and transferring material goods. But you know, we can have communistic relations which are sort of ongoing. You don't need to keep count because people will always be there for you. So you can have hierarchical relations which are also similarly permanent, but instead of being governed by reciprocity, if you give something to a superior, they'll expect you to do it again. And then you have relations of exchange, and exchange is not between people who are ostensibly equal, formally equal, but have no necessary ongoing relationship. So, you know, I swap something with you, you give something to me, we walk away. So we only have ongoing relations if somebody hasn't paid up. Which is interesting, because it implies that the moment you start imagining everything as exchange, then the only reason people have to have relationships with each other is if a transaction has not been completed. But that means somebody actually didn't do something they really ought to have done. In fact, it's quite likely that both parties did, you know. There's actually this great story I found in a medieval Buddhist monk from Japan. Has this book about strange and extraordinary occurrences in Japan in my day. And one of them that really struck me was a story of premature reincarnation. About this loan shark. Woman, she's a wife of the governor. She was like constantly like lending money at high interest and making people's lives a living hell. People would flee the province, go into hiding when her goons came to find them. And as a result, when she died, Buddhism is interesting because unlike Christianity and Islam, they're not against taking interest in principle. But anything can be done too much. So he's telling the story. When she died, after 2 days, they're saying prayers over the coffin. Suddenly the coffin opens and she springs to life, but she's half ox. And it's a horrible, twisted monster, and it's hard they don't eating grass, and they don't know what to do, and like they try giving all the money back quickly. Oh, get this over with, and hopefully she'll just die. She does eventually. But the monk is discussing this, and he says, well, you know, there is a sutra that says, well, if you owe somebody money and you die, you're in mortal peril because, you know, you might well be reborn an ox in the barn of the guy you owe money to. However, obviously, as a case like this shows, it can go the other way. You know, if you're too mean about taking back the money and harassing people about giving money, then you could get reborn an ox in their barn. In fact, I guess she owed so many different, she'd done this to so many different people, she just sort of became an ox, you know, in general. And I thought about this, and I thought, well, yeah, it's a perfect illustration of that kind of moral ambivalence, right? Because, well, obviously you're not shaking somebody down unless they have, you know, not paid you the money they owe you. So, you know, they're already in mortal peril of being reborn an ox in your barn, and then suddenly you're shaking them down, you're in mortal peril of being... You can't both be reborn an ox in each other's barn, right? Somebody's got to be worse. So who decides, right? Is there some sort of karmic scale of just how bad a deadbeat you have to be versus just how mean a creditor you have to be to figure out who gets to be an ox? So in fact, that problem shows up over and over again. You know, when you imagine everything is exchange, everything's a debt. And life is sin, social relations themselves become sort of problematic, and this is in fact in commercial economies that religions often do come to this conclusion. I mean, it doesn't have to. Like, there's other circumstances where debt is good, at least for people who aren't too close or too far away. It's sort of the right way for people to deal with each other. It's another famous story that I really like about anthropologist named Laura Bohannon went to do field work among people called the Tiv in central Nigeria. And, she was clueless. She didn't know what to do. She showed up in a house and people kind of came with baskets of food and dropped them. Here's some okra. Want some eggs, fish, And she didn't know what this meant, so she would just write them in a little notebook. So, what anthropologists do. Eventually some neighbors took pity on her and they came to explain what was going on. And they said, look, you do have to reciprocate. You're expected to give that back or something of equivalent value. But you got to make sure not to give them something of exactly the same value, right? Because, say they gave you some okra worth 3 shillings. Well, give them something worth 2 shillings or give them something worth 4 shillings. Preferably not okra, that's too obvious. But, something, everybody knows the price, But because if you give them something worth exactly the same value of what they gave you, that's like saying, yeah, the hell of you, I don't want to see you anymore. You want to make sure there's a little bit of debt between everybody, because then we all have an excuse to come visit and drop stuff off and hang out and get the gossip, and that's neighborhood, that's community. So a little bit of debt can be good. Of course, that all depends on the existence of money. Of course, money becomes the critical thing here, and the morality of debt really turns on the existence of money. Because what is a debt? A debt is basically a promise which you can quantify. A debt is a type of promise, but it is a promise which can become impersonal owing to the fact that it can be mathematical and thus transferable, right? So you can take a debt and transfer it to someone else, which you can't do with most types of promise. Somebody promises to love you forever or something like that. You can't actually give that to someone else. Or even if they promise to meet you at 3. A debt you can. All right, so this raises the question of what is money, and I started thinking about that. And I discovered something really interesting, which is that economists don't know. There's no consensus among economists as to what money is, which is quite remarkable, because you'd think if there's anything they would kind of have a handle on by now, right? It wouldn't be money, but no. They argue about it all the time. I mean, there's kind of 3 principles they throw out, but they don't know which one comes first or how it starts or which is the central one. Is it a medium of exchange? Is it a measure of value? Is it a store of value? The predominant view, mainstream economists say it's currency comes first. It's a medium of exchange, and then becomes a way of measuring the value of other things. But there's another view, which is often associated with what's called chartalism, which says no, it's the other way around. Money actually is debt. It's a way of accounting for comparing debts. So it's really a means of account, and only later does it start circulating around. That's a secondary function. They're considered a little bit crazy by a lot of or sort of marginal wingnutty type people by many mainstream economists, but it never goes away, because archaeologists, historians tend to support their position, because all historical evidence that exists implies that they are correct. It's kind of a quandary here. And as an anthropologist, this is a particularly it's kind of a pet peeve. I must admit this. One reason why anthropologists really find economists annoying, there's this kind of opposition that's existed for at least 100 years, is this, we call it the myth of barter. Basically, there's a standard story that everybody learns about the origins of money. I mean, you've all heard it, right? A million times, I'm sure. Once upon a time, people used to, they didn't have money. So what did they have to do? Well, they had to swap things, right? So you have a cow. I need a cow. I say, tell you what, I'll give you 30 chickens for that cow. And, now 40, 45. You negotiate, come to a deal. You swap. Problem has, sometimes he doesn't want my chicken. Sometimes he doesn't want anything I happen to have. What do? Well, no deal. You have to go home. Eventually, it becomes so annoying, you decide you have to invent money. And, it happens naturally. People stockpile things they think people will want on an irregular basis, which for some reason tends to be shiny pieces of metal. And that there's a virtuous circle. Everybody wants it because everybody wants it. Eventually it turns into money. The government gets in on the operation mainly to validate the quality and weight of the money, and then the government, of course, being bad and all the economic versions, cheats and debases the currency. Eventually people come up with credit. So you get barter, you get money, you get credit. Securitized derivatives are simply the sort of last link of this inevitable chain, right? It all makes sense. There's one big problem. And this story was actually first really proposed by Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations in 1776. And, to Adam Smith's credit, he didn't know. He was just guessing, right? He just thought this must be how it must have worked. They didn't really have a lot of ethnographic information at their disposal in Scottish libraries in 1776. So I would let Adam Smith off the hook on this one. But some of these other guys, I don't know what their deal is. Because, we've gone out into the world for 200 years trying to find any place in the world where, ordinary everyday transactions take the form of, I'll give you 30 chickens for that cow. They do not exist. You find thousands of different interesting variations, ways of distributing goods and services in places where they don't have money. Incredibly creative ones, just never that one. For example, Adam Smith's big example was, when he did get concrete, he'd usually say, well, Siberian nomads or Native Americans, Northeast woodlands, Algonquians, or Iroquoian speakers, they're swapping arrowheads for beaver pelts and stuff like that. When people actually did go out and start writing books about how people in such societies did actually distribute things, well, what they found out was this was like completely crazy. For example, one of the major ways of distributing goods and services was through dreams, because they actually had this theory that dreams are suppressed desires that we are not consciously aware of, and it can only be realized by being interpreted through a coded language. Basically, Iroquoians had invented Freudianism in the 1600s, so you had to guess people's dreams. Basically, what people actually did has no relation to what the economists thought would be going on. Iroquoian, most goods and services, when they weren't doing dream guessing, was done through women's councils, which allocated stuff in a democratic fashion. So if you're a guy and you actually want a beaver pelt, you go to your wife and she talks to the women's council. Friedrich Engels got very excited when he learned this, but economists just completely ignored it. They just kept on with the story about the people swapping things. It remains in textbooks to this day, which is, again, odd, because, I actually pulled 20 economic textbooks, like all the biggest and fattest of them. There's really large textbooks on the shelf there at Goldsmiths, so I thought, all right, let's go to the section on money and see what they say, like how they handle this problem that nobody's ever actually found a place where they do barter. And sure enough, the really early ones are still saying, well, primitive societies will do barter. But the new ones, they come up with a new approach. They say, imagine you lived in a society without money. What would you have to do? Say you were trying to get breakfast, orange juice and potato, and eggs with no money. You'd have to swap something, wouldn't you? So they do it as a thought experiment, but they still tell the story. They have to tell the story. All right. So the first thing that I realized when I thought about this is, you do find occasions where people will do barter. It's not like unprecedented in human history. It says neighbors will never do it with each other. It happens between strangers. So it's really hard to imagine how a money system is going to emerge from occasional relations between strangers, because if you have systematic relations, then you get fixed equivalences. And basically the economic thing doesn't work. But it's really obvious why neighbors aren't going to do this, and it's really obvious what's going on is they're trying to make up a story which completely eliminates the possibility of credit and debt, because they're assuming that neighbors in a Neolithic village are going to be engaging with each other only in what economists call the spot trade. I'll give you this, you give me that, we walk away. Well, why? That's ridiculous, right? Because, say I'll give you 30 chickens for that cow, and he doesn't want my chickens. I'm his neighbor. I'm going to have something he wants eventually, and it's good to have neighbors in your dad. So, in fact, what actually can be observed to happen, actually is a custom in many times and places, that if you just praise something belonging to another person, they kind of have to give it to you. There's a great story about this, a Maori story about this guy who took advantage of this, and he would just walk up and down the beach, and every time a fisherman came home, he'd say, "Wow, that's a beautiful squid, I love squid." The guy would be like, "Right, here's a squid," He just do this all the time. "Wow, that's a whitefish, that's a good one, yeah, very nice whitefish." So, after about 2 years of doing this all the time, they formed a war party and killed him. Because it's actually easier to smash someone's head in than to say, "No, I'm not going to give you the squid this time." All right, so you have to give it to them. So what would you actually do? You walk up to the guy, you say, "Wow, what a magnificent cow. That's a beautiful cow." And the guy say, "Oh, you want the cow? You like it? It's really not much, but take my cow, please. Oh, you're a friend. I love you. Just take it away. Don't even think about giving me anything back." But of course, now we all know, you owe him one, right? And what do you owe him? Something roughly like a cow. Often there are ranked systems. A cow is sort of like a canoe and sort of like a necklace, a jade necklace, but, chicken's more like a pearl necklace or, a hammer. So there's sort of rough things that are sort of like other things that you could, But money, how is money going to grow out of that? It doesn't make there's no obvious way that it would come out of that. Barter system, they come up with all these mathematical formulas of how it can produce money, except barter doesn't happen, so that wouldn't happen. So where do you get money from a system like that? Because money is a system of exact proportionality, right? 27 of these equals 3 of these. Well, sometimes somebody is cheap, they owe you something like a cow, and they'll before you can ask for something else, and you can ask for anything, right? That's a beautiful necklace you have, or have I mentioned that my son is deeply in love with your daughter? There's a million things. Or you could just leave it and because it's nice to have a guy in your dad. And makes them uncomfortable. Sometimes they might try to head you off and say, "Oh, by the way, I just found this old, canoe here. You take that." And, it's obviously not the equivalent of a cow. And if so, you might mock him as a cheapskate, right? But you're unlikely to come up with a mathematical formula for exactly how cheap you think he was. So when are you going to start quantifying like this? Well, the answer seems to be when violence ensues, when people are very angry. That's when they get exact. And so, say you're mocking him as a cheapskate, everybody's drunk, swords are pulled out, somebody's ear gets cut off. Well, often it will be the case that they'll have very specific, penalties, even in places where you don't have markets, for, one eye is worth 27 heifers, a ear is worth 17, this part of the finger, that part of the finger. They'll be very, very specific. And that's exactly the circumstance when you're not going to be sort of easygoing about the thing, right? I mean, it's like 27 heifers or this means war, feud will result. And if you don't have heifers, well, then you do have a problem, don't you? You have to substitute something else. And in fact, often early legal codes, even medieval ones, have incredibly detailed breakdowns of how to do this. There's these early Irish and Welsh law codes. There was insults were actually the big thing. Everybody had an honor price, which is like how, what people have to pay if they insult you. And it varies by your social status, but also you can get demoted or by behavior. So kings are worth 24 cows, which doesn't seem like much, but there are actually hundreds of kings in ancient Ireland. But if you run away in battle, you can get demoted and only be worth 12. So forth and so on. You can lose your honor price entirely if you do something really bad. And people are free to insult you. But, so even if they kill you, it's like 6 cows for killing you and 12 cows for insulting you by killing you. But, they'd have a breakdown of what you can substitute, because you don't necessarily have 12 cows. So they would actually have, like, everything in a house, like from the rafters to the cauldron to the silverware, what it's worth in exact quantitative terms for figuring out how to pay fines. Even though none of those items are available for sale in markets. We didn't really have markets at that point in Celtic, on the Celtic fringe there. Okay, so it's in these circumstances of violence you start quantifying that money seems to emerge. Credit systems, gradually from various things like this, money emerges as a sort of system of account, not so much as currency. And this is, like, I think the great discovery, the single greatest discovery I made in researching this book. It really surprised me, is that there's a pattern, actually. Well, first of all, the sort of standard line, okay, first there was barter, then there was money, then there was credit. Well, that's actually, not only is it wrong, it's actually backwards. First there's credit, then you get coinage. It's invented much later, 2,000 years later. When you do get barter, people saying, I'll give you 20 chickens for that cow, it's usually where there used to be money, but somehow the source of money dries up. So people are trying to do the same thing without the money. So, in Russia in the 1990s, or prisons, that's another famous example. Everybody grew up using money, but now they don't have any. So there's like using cigarettes and things like that. All right, so you start with credit, and for 2,000 years, actually, it seems that people were operating, there's a fixed equivalent in Mesopotamia in silver and grain, and that basically functions as money, but they're not actually using the silver. I mean, occasionally merchants would actually turn over the silver, but for the most part, they appear to be basically putting stuff on the tab with your local merchant, and then every 6 months to a year you pay off and whatever he's willing to accept of that equivalent value in silver. So they didn't even actually make scales accurate enough to like measure out the tiny bits of silver that would have been required to, buy a shirt or a hammer or something like that. But people were buying those things. Okay, so markets, they come about as a side effect of these legal codes, administrative systems of temples where they have to allocate stuff. Who have the principle of interest is invented around this time. And Michael Hudson, actually, economist, likes to make the argument that one of the great problems of all subsequent history has been that when they invented the principle of charging interest on loans, they also had the principle of periodic cancellation. And they kind of exported half of that. And, we've been suffering ever since. Because what would happen is, since money is an IOU, it's a credit arrangement primarily. What's to stop it from going crazy? Well, occasionally it would. You'd have these debt crises, and throughout human history, these debt crises are sort of the worst case scenario. When Hammurabi, or a Confucian scholar, is trying to imagine like the worst thing that can happen. Aristotle, usually the ideas of the debt trap. People, more and more of the population fall into debt. They're selling off their flocks and fields, or they're getting them repossessed. Gradually, their children are taken off into debt peonage. Sometimes they have to sell themselves into slavery to stop that from happening. So governments will intervene and cancel everything. Clean slate. However, around 600 AD, suddenly they invent coinage. Coinage is invented to pay soldiers. It appears almost simultaneously in India, China, and the Eastern Aegean to pay mercenaries or conscripts. Usually when it's mercenaries, it's gold and silver, where it's conscripts, it's just bronze. But nonetheless, it's always used as a side effect of military operations, which makes sense because, soldiers are the last people you're going to want to extend credit to anyway. If you're emergent, they're heavily armed, they're just passing through, and they tend to have a lot of little bits of gold and silver because they've been looting and pillaging, right? So you just systematize that. Taxes are basically ways of governments use to set up markets. So they demand taxes and money, and then give the money to the soldiers. So basically, you're just employing your entire population, which now has to give you those coins back again, to get stuff to soldiers. So that's basically how it works. So throughout history, markets crop up around military military operations, and particularly cash markets. But they're also used to get slaves, because the soldiers go out and they get slaves, put slaves to work in the mines, getting more money, so you can give that to the soldiers. It's this whole kind of horrible circle. In these periods, you still have debt revolts, but the usual solution is not to cancel the debts, because now you suddenly think money actually is a thing. People are actually using cash in everyday transactions, especially any place where there's a military base nearby. They do another technique. They just kind of throw money at the problem. So they have all these sort of Romans sort of bred in circuses, or Athens paying people to go to jury duty or to the agora, to prevent debt crises and social crisis from happening. Also, you get the rise of world religions, which interestingly almost invariably start as anti-war movements against these new militaristic, cash-paying armies. In the Middle Ages, suddenly the armies fall apart. There's kind of, in every case, in India and China and in Europe, there's a last-ditch effort to the empire tries to adopt one of these religions, which really start as anti-imperial, anti-war movements, to save itself. It doesn't usually work. But the empires collapse, the standing armies dissolve, you go back to virtual credit money. So what you find in the Middle Ages is they're using checks in the Middle East. Check is an Arabic word, meaning check. They're using paper money in China, which starts as credit instruments and the state adopts it. They're using tally sticks and imaginary money in Europe. They have this crazy system where they're still using Roman and then Carolingian money, even though it doesn't physically exist, to make the calculations. And then they're using things like tally sticks to notch sticks, and they break them in half. And one half is called the stock, and one is called the stub. That's actually where those words come from, to keep track of who owes what to who. But in the meantime, the world religions sort of take over, and they impose various rules to make sure that people don't fall into debt traps, and protect debtors against creditors. So you get anti-usury laws, or start doing debt cancellation again in China, so forth and so on. Slavery largely disappears, one of the great social victories of human history that we never talk about. And actually, the Middle Ages look kind of good in retrospect. Until around 1450, it all starts going backwards, much sped up by the discovery of the Americas and all that cash, gold and silver flowing in. You go back to gold and silver, you go back to standing armies, slavery comes back, large empires, and that's the period we're coming out of now. 1971, Nixon goes off the gold standard, and we're 30 years in, right? So it's hardly yet begun, and everybody thinks, it's all made possible by computers. We're entering this age of virtual money. It's unprecedented. No, it's not. This is actually the original form of money, and the interesting thing is we seem to have gone about it completely backwards in historical terms. Because what usually happens when money is an IOU, it's a virtual political arrangement, is, once you understand that, as people are well aware in the Middle Ages, for example, you have to set up some mechanism to protect debtors from creditors, or the whole thing goes crazy. Everybody, falls into debt traps, which they are doing now, right? And why? Because we did the opposite. We created things like the IMF, which protect creditors against debtors. Completely backwards from what everybody else has done when this happens in other periods of human history. And sure enough, if Aristotle were here today and he was looking at America, he would probably think that the distinction between being so deeply indebted that you are, selling yourself to work for others and being so deeply indebted that you are renting yourself to work for others is sort of a legalistic distinction at best. We're there. We're in this great social crisis that people throughout human history were most afraid of. But I end on an optimistic note because 500-year cycles we're talking here, right? 40 years is nothing. We still have plenty of time to get it right. And I think that, the social movements that we're seeing cropping up around debt issues since 2008, in 2008 they kind of let the cat out of the bag. You don't really have to pay your debts at all, do you? If you're AIG, right? They can wave these various magic wands and make trillions of dollars of debt disappear if it's somebody that actually matters to them. So now that we know that, I think what people are saying effectively is okay, now that we understand that money is a social construct, it's a political arrangement, if democracy is to mean anything, it means that, we all got to be in on on the discussion and the decision-making of like who makes promises to who, what promises are kept, and when circumstances change, what promises are renegotiated, which is what always happens when circumstances change. The big guys can do it. You know, if democracy is to have meaning, it has to be apply to everyone else. We need to sort of accept that we are in a phase of money that has radically different political implications, and you know, it's not less, the rich can live in this new world of virtual money, and we're still living in the Bronze Age. So I end with a call for a jubilee. It's not really a policy prescription so much as it's just trying to throw out a bomb. But although actually, you know, Saudi Arabia did it. Most people don't know this. That was their response to the Arab Spring. They like doubled security spending and then they canceled all debts. So it's possible. It's not like it can't happen. They also don't want you to know this. So it's probably seems like part of the conditions for being allowed to do it is like not to tell. Yeah, so it's perfectly possible to do, even if you don't have a king, which they do. But I think it would be useful, not only just because it would help so many people in very concrete ways, but it's a way of sort of, it's not just a clean slate economically, but it's a clean slate conceptually. You know, we need to figure out a mechanism that will shock everybody into the realization that things are not the way they've been represented. We're in a new world now, and we need to rethink our very most basic categories. And I think it would be practical. Actually, the Boston Consulting Group, I'll just throw this out at the end, did a model. I didn't even know about this. Rumor has it was partly inspired by my book, but I don't know if that's really true. Trying to figure out what would happen if they actually did do a jubilee. And they said it would cause severe economic disruption, but not doing it would cause even more. So it might actually be a policy prescription. Anyway, I think it would be a very good idea.
So I think we've got a little bit of time left for questions, maybe 10 minutes or so of questions from folks. Anybody with a burning question after that talk?
What was your opinion of the Greek debt, and if Greeks should just actually not pay their debt?
Well, they're not paying their debts. I mean, it's happening. It's been clear for at least 6 months that there's no way that there's not going to be a default. The question is how they're going to dress it up. I mean, the interesting thing there is like the military connection. I didn't have time to go into this, but you know, like modern money is basically circulating war debt, and a lot of the Greek debt is military debt. They have the highest military spending per capita of any place in Europe, and nobody's talking about that element. You know, there's a cycle where these German and French banks lend the money, and then they buy German and French weapons with it. And my solution, I have a perfectly good solution to the Greek debt crisis. I think, why don't they just repossess the battleships? You know, nobody talks about that. You know, why take it out of people's pensions? You know, just take all their weapons away. But yeah, it shows something about our political discourse that this hasn't even been broached. 1, 2, yeah. You're welcome. What do I think of the future of the Occupy movement is the question. Well, I mean, look, when we were trying to throw this thing together in August, you know, we were handed this with 7 weeks, which is no preparation time. No money, resources. Basically, I spent much of that time. My biggest worry was how to ensure that we didn't just get instantly beaten up, put in jail, you know, all these great kids who'd never really done actions before, you know, didn't get like instantly beaten up, put in jail, traumatized, and nobody even knew it happened. You know, like we had no idea this was going to take off like this. So I mean, obviously it happened so fast and became so big that like there's got to be a lull. I mean, there's couldn't keep, you know, if it kept growing at the rate it was growing, we would have like world revolution and by now. You know, so clearly, you know, there's going to be a moment of stepping back, and I think people are organizing now on the May Day general strike. I think they decided, like, let's actually do something where we don't have 7 weeks, where we have a little bit of time to actually plan. So I think that was a good decision, and I'm very much optimistic about how that'll turn out. We had someone back there, and then yeah. And then 1, 2, 3.
Your ideas for a strategy, what kind of strategy ideas do you have for starting a debt strike?
Well, me, I don't know. There are people doing it. The problem of doing a debt strike, it's very difficult because, one thing that debt does is it sort of it reinforces alienation. There's this kind of shame element that makes it very difficult. What people are working on foreclosure stuff, and there's been some very successful organizing around that. But the first thing you have to do is get people over the embarrassment because everybody thinks it's their fault somehow. And that's in a foreclosure. At least you can have a neighborhood where people are all foreclosed and get them to meet each other. But it becomes much harder when you're dealing with something like student debt, where people don't. Everybody's in the same situation, but they don't talk to each other necessarily because they're working all the time to pay their debts. I think so. It's historically been very difficult to organize around debt. I think the most effective technique that I've heard of, there's these guys, Occupy Student Debt, who have the idea of a pledge. The idea is get everybody to sign a pledge saying once we have 1 million signatures, or whatever it is, I think it's 1 million, 1 million signatures on this document, we'll all stop paying at once. And even having that document, once you start getting near 1 million signatures, I'm sure the other guys are going to start negotiating real fast. This is the idea. So you might not even have to do it. So what did we have? We had 2 people on stack, but I don't remember who they were. Yes. And then,
Several weeks, 7 weeks to put this together when we were handed this. Who is the we who handed it?
People who showed up at a meeting, there was an advertisement on August 2nd for a General Assembly in Bowling Green, which was put out by, Adbusters had announced the idea of an Occupy Wall Street thing, and then we saw this thing, we didn't know who put it out for a General Assembly. It turned out to be like these guys from the Workers' World Party, the guys who put out Answer, and a bunch of other similar groups mostly had sort of hijacked the thing. And the first thing that happened was the horizontals, the people who wanted to do this democratically, kind of had to hijack the meeting back from them. It's kind of a long story. It was very exciting at the time. But we started tapping on people's shoulders saying, hey, how about we break off and form a real assembly? And then they had to, anyway, but I could tell the whole story. But basically what ended up happening is Adbusters had done no prep work. They just thrown out the idea. And once we'd sort of created a directly democratic group that started doing it, we realized they'd already set a date, which was not only was it 7 weeks and only 7 weeks later, it was also a Saturday. So you can't even do, if you wanted the people at Wall Street to even notice you were there, you had to figure out a way to stick there for 2 days. So we were kind of and they'd advertise it on the web to 90,000 people, but hadn't done anything. So that was the situation we were in. That's why I said handed. Yeah.
So, who are we?
The people who showed up at that meeting.
And who are the people who showed up at the meeting?
You want me to give you all their names? I mean,
You're the first person now from the beginning, and you're the first person who credit for starting.
I was one of 80 people at a meeting. You want the names of all 80 people? I mean,
I don't see it published anywhere.
so it's been it's been in all the papers. I mean, yeah. You go to Harper's, Vanity Fair. They've all New Yorker now has a story about it. There's a picture of it you can get on Sean Karpetian's website. He has a picture of us all sitting there. Yeah, it's there. It's all the information's out there by now. And of course, when my new book comes out, the whole chapter. Yeah.
I'm a student starting out playing the double major in economics and biology. Your comments on economics textbooks I really kind of take to heart.
Yeah.
Earlier today,
Mm-hmm.
written by a guy who was an economic advisor in the Bush administration. There are statements in there that are just insane.
Yeah.
I'm kind of curious about. It seems like such a hermetic field, and so some of the more creative critiques that come from an anthropological point of view, or some geographers. I've read that economists tend to be very. They don't like the use of purpose. I'm curious if that's true. If so, maybe that's why it's so closed off. And then also just give me advice for someone who's just starting economics student, other than
Yeah, well, there's a lot of very interesting heterodox forms about economics. I mean, the problem is there's a dominant mainstream, which is dominant not because it actually can predict anything, but because it's politically, correct from the point of view of the ruling class. I mean, think about the fact that everybody always points out, just as all, before Iraq, all the guys who said Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction were considered respectable, and all the guys who said he didn't were considered wingnuts. And after they find out that he didn't, all those guys who were wrong are still respectable, and the guys who are right are still wingnuts. I mean, it's the same in economics. Like the guys who predicted the bubble, are mostly still considered insane, even though they were right. But there's a reason for that, which is the role of public economists anyway isn't to be right. It's like to talk up the market. I mean, talking down the market is considered a sin. It's considered because your role is performative. You're creating the thing you describe. I always think that economists and anthropologists are on opposite poles as disciplines because, think of it this way: like I'm an anthropologist and I describe a ritual. And I come back 10 years later and I discover they're using my book to do the ritual. Right? It has happened, anthropologists, and we're really freaked out. It's like, no, that's not the idea. But if we're an economist, that's not a problem at all. I mean, they're telling people how to behave. And that's the ambiguity. Is it a descriptive discipline, or is it a prescriptive discipline, or where's the border? It's never clear. So there are lots of very interesting branches of economics, like the modern money theory, the post-Keynesians, and there's all various interesting stuff going on. I mean, but they're necessarily going to be marginal because it's not accuracy. I mean, the example I always give on this that really impresses me about economics is behavioral economics. Because a lot of microeconomics is based on certain core assumptions about human behavior, which were never actually tested. They just assumed, right? People will do X and Y and Z. And it finally occurred to a bunch of psychologists, like, why don't we do an experiment and see if they're true? Maybe 20, 30 years ago. And, surprisingly enough, they discovered, actually about a third of them are right. And a third are kind of not exactly, and 1/3 is totally wrong. People don't do that at all. Now, has this affected what economists say in any way? No, they just keep on saying the same thing because they don't have to. I mean, so it tells you something about the power. If you are the hegemonic, master discipline that everybody reads, decides on policy has to read, you're not there to describe reality most accurately. You're there to sort of map out an image of how people are actually ideally supposed to behave. It's almost a utopian discipline.
I think we're going to wrap up. We haven't had any women actually ask.
Oh, well, there we go.
We have, this
okay.
young lady right there, and then move on to signing.
So I'm actually interested in what this gentleman was saying about this call for adbusters. There's been another call to go to Chicago.
Oh, yeah.
And what's interesting is I was on the phone with Chicago. They didn't know this was going to happen. So what do you do?
I don't know who did that either. Do you know who did that?
Well, adbusters did a call out to go to Chicago.
Was that Kai Lassen did it, or they didn't tell me?
I don't know which person. It's just a campaign. It's always been an interesting thing when these things crop up, because I had, I can disclose my identity, right? I had registered Occupy Xmas months ahead of time once this came up, because I knew, this is the big thing, right? We're coming, and then all of a sudden there was this campaign, and here I had this website, this domain, and all of a sudden I was forced to use it. I didn't really know how to make websites. But I wonder, what is your take on this idea that, they put it out there, and if people respond, then it will be successful. But what kind of organizing does it take on the ground to respond to a call of such magnitude? And what does it look like if we fail?
Yeah, the Chicago thing is weird. My problem is I have to write a book in a matter of weeks, so I haven't really been able to follow the details of what's going on. I mean, you have to bear in mind with adbusters, it's not like, there are some Singalis who can manipulate people. They put out 8 calls for actions over the years, 7 of which completely flubbed and nobody did them. I mean, so they do this all the time. This time people kind of took it up because it was the right moment, and they didn't have anything to do with the organizing. I mean, God. Which is too bad because we had no money, but nonetheless. this thing, because my understanding is that people put out a call to do local actions all over the country on May Day, and then suddenly Adbusters is putting out this thing for a summit thing, and I to be honest, I don't know more because I have to figure this out when I get back to New York. I have some IWW friends who are very upset about this and wanted to get me to talk to them and tell them to cut it out, which I don't know. It's too late once you put out a call, and maybe then if you don't do it, it's going to be embarrassing. I mean, you can't really put out an anti-call. Sorry, never mind. I mean, I'm not really sure, but I think that is what was exciting to me about the May 1st stuff was the local focus, and I think it would be really distracting. I mean, you can have something bigger in Chicago. I mean, but it would have been nice to have the Chicago action on a different day. I don't know if there's anything we can do about it now.
Can't you issue a whoops?
Me? I mean, I don't know. Let's see. I mean, I gotta get in touch with all those guys and see what's going on. I mean, they're saying. I mean, it's an interesting philosophical thing because a lot of people are saying, oh, well, summit hopping in general is bad. We're reverting, and I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think there is a place for big, convergences. People get to actually meet each other. It's nice. Sort of an advertisement for the movement, but I think it's potentially complementary to local organizing, but not on the same day. I mean, I don't know what they were thinking. I got to figure out what's going on there.
So I think we're going to wrap things up now. Actually, in terms of talking about coordinating action and stuff, we do have a sort of Occupy display here in the store. There's a space. Any of you all who are involved, feel free to drop off flyers at any point in time. There's actually a little take action envelope you can put in things if you're wanting to reach the broader community here. Please make use of that space. If you would help me just thank David Graeber.
You've been listening to the Skylight Books author reading series. Don't forget that you can check out this and all of our other great podcasts at www.skylightbooks.com. Today's music was provided by Fragile Gang. You can check them out at MySpace, Facebook, and the iTunes Music Store. Thanks for stopping by, and we hope to see you soon.